We are going to get the program started, and I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Tim Winger, the chair of the 2023 Chamber. I'd like to welcome you all for the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce annual meeting, purposefully named State of Missoula. I am very happy to open the 2023 installment by asking you all to stand and continue the Chamber's tradition of opening our gatherings with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So we all understand these events can't happen without the companies that lead with their support. I've been to many of the meetings, and when I see the banners and I think about the companies that are traditionally up here, just, you know, the same faces show up quite a bit. We have two great companies in Missoula that are leading us today with their support. We'd like to thank you on behalf of the board, the staff, the members, and all the people here today. We want to thank Jackson Contractor Group and Telephone Data Systems, or TDS, for sponsoring the event today. There's a lot of other important companies that support the efforts of the Chamber during the year. There's a gathering of them called the Visionary Members, and they are First Security Bank, the University of Montana, Northwestern Energy, the Missoulian, and Southgate Mall. I'd also mention that MCAT's here today, broadcasting or recording for rebroadcasting, so we thank them for being here today. Keep people informed. I'd also add that every member, every company, every membership dollar that comes in to the Chamber is invaluable as we advocate for business in Missoula. Also, as chair this year, been to a lot more events than I'd ever been to before. The staff and the amount of volunteers the Chamber has that show up at Redcoat, Chamber, golf tournaments, these events, the networking events, the Missoula Young Professionals. It's amazing the people that are involved and their energy for it. And as far as the state of Missoula, I think we're pretty healthy and vibrant on the volunteerism end of things. So I want to thank all of you that show up and make these things possible. So we'll move this thing right along, and at this time it's my privilege to introduce Matt Brossman, Vice President of Jackson Contractor Group, one of the sponsors today. Matt, why don't you come up and give us a few words?
Matt Brossman, Jackson Contractor Group, as Tim introduced me already. Really appreciate being here. Thanks for the Chamber for hosting this event. Thanks for everyone here to come and really support this community. Jackson Contractor Group has been here headquartered in Missoula for about 23 years now. We are very vested in this community, both on the economy side, but in the community itself. We have a lot of employees and families that live and work and enjoy this beautiful community. So the great thing is that we want to continue to, in our line of business, it's all about constant improvement, making things better, and I think that's why everyone is here. So again, thanks for having us, and we're proud to be here and proud to sponsor the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And also with us today is Ryan Corwin, Associate Field Manager of Field Marketing for Telephone Data Systems, TDS. got a few words for us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Corwin, lifelong Missoulian, but 2-week employee so far at TDS. They trust me so much they sent me with a script, but I'm going to riff on that a little bit. TDS Telecom is bringing symmetrical fiber to Missoula, a revolution that has been needed in our tech services for a long time. And because I am a tech employee, I have this really cool badge on a lanyard, which I can snap like that. Our goal here in Missoula is to run symmetrical fiber internet to over 35,000 residential homes. On top of that, we will stack business services as well, and that's just in the Missoula Metro over the next 2 to 3 years. We are in the ground now as of March, and we are continuing our build-out with first customers, hopefully hooking up by fall. I encourage you to go to tdsfiber.com to pre-register, because the more people in your neighborhood who register, the earlier you get our service. And having conversations over the last couple of weeks with folks, I know that high-speed, reliable fiber internet service is very much needed throughout Missoula. So we're excited to be here, and we want to say thanks to our partners TAC West Shore and the engineering firm Copilot for helping us bring this service to Missoula. If you have any questions, again, Ryan Corwin with TDS, and you can find me at this table right down here, and you can also look us up, tdsfiber.com. Thank you so much for having us today.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Outcomes and opportunities is our theme for today's panel. In many ways, that has been the Chamber's mantra the past few years, focusing on important initiatives: workforce, childcare, business recruitment, addiction, and supporting the University of Montana. We also are led by a well-informed membership and worked on local issues, grants, and infrastructure, connecting and collaborating to facilitate and improve business and community. Outcomes have been great, supporting and achieving grant efforts, giving a voice to business on local issues, facilitating and supporting connections, facilitating partnerships and investment. So outcomes and opportunities seem to be a timely theme for today's events. The Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce as a board collectively believed inviting these 4 key people to the legislative process would provide a great opportunity for the Missoula business community to discover the outcomes and opportunities of the 2023 session. Before we bring up our first panelists, I'd like to make an observation regarding this year's session. Being deeply immersed in the Chamber and other associations, I've had the privilege to be party to many discussions, debates, and activities that demonstrate the collaborations, partnerships, and disagreement that make Missoula a great place to live. The passion and work ethic of the people who work every day to improve our community has been an honor, privilege, and a treat to see. I applaud the work of many people in this room advocating for our community, and I'm very happy to be a part of this program today. So to proceed, I am privileged and excited to move this program forward by introducing Lieutenant Governor Kristen Juras. Kristen is a 4th-generation Montanan who grew up on her family's ranch near Conrad. Kristen Juras is a wife, mother, grandmother, attorney, and public servant. On November 3rd, 2020, Kristen became the 2nd female elected Lieutenant Governor of Montana in the state's history. Lieutenant Governor Kristen Juras serves as a partner to Governor Greg Gianforte as they lead the Montana comeback. Kristen has broken the traditional mode of the office of Lieutenant Governor. One news story revealed her performance of the Lieutenant Governor's role is also unique, particularly in a position that is often seen as more ceremonial than substantive. Kristen leads the Governor's Red Tape Relief Task Force to cut unnecessary, burdensome regulations that are a wet blanket on job creation and hamper small business owners, farmers, and ranchers. Kristen plays a key role in policymaking and is actively involved in appointments to boards, commissions, and judicial vacancies. Before entering public service, Kristen Juras served for 32 years as an attorney in private practice in Great Falls, where she helped farmers, ranchers, and small business owners navigate legal issues. As an attorney, Kristen Juras provided pro bono legal services to clients with disabilities who confront homelessness and addiction. Kristen received the Robert P. Goff Pro Bono Award in recognition of her commitment to pro bono legal services. In 2000, Kristen joined the faculty at the University of Montana School of Law, teaching classes in property, contracts, estate planning, taxation, business, international, and agricultural law. Kristen graduated from Conrad High School, the University of Montana, and the University of Georgia Law School. Married since 1984, Kristen and her husband, John, are proud parents to 3 sons and grandparents to 2 grandchildren. It's my honor to introduce Lieutenant Governor Kristen Juras.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everybody from Governor Gianforte and myself. Boy, that was a rodeo, you guys, wasn't it? And they saved the bull riding for the last event of the legislative session. Of course, we began from the administration's perspective preparing for the legislative session not too long after they left in 2021. And one of the groups that we worked especially close with was the Montana Chamber of Commerce, because it's one of the priorities of our administration to provide a fair, predictable business climate for our Montana businesses, so that you all, we don't want to give you a special treatment or not necessarily a hands up, but just to level the playing field and make sure that your businesses can thrive. And personally, that's important to me. When I graduated from the University of Montana in 1977, I couldn't get a job in the state. I had to leave the state, which is why I ended up going to law school in Georgia. When my youngest son graduated from Montana Tech, by the way, I come from a diverse family. I'm a Grizz, but I have a Bobcat, I have an Ore Digger, and I have another Grizz in the family, so we're well represented at all football games. But when my youngest graduated as an Ore Digger in electrical engineering, he could not find a job in the state of Montana, nor could his 4 very talented roommates, all from Montana. They all had to go. So it truly is a priority of ours to create job opportunities here so that if our children and our grandchildren want to stay, and why wouldn't they, they have the job opportunities to do that they all have good paying jobs. As Tim mentioned, one of our projects is the red tape relief, and what that means is we've asked the 13 agencies under the governor's jurisdiction to read every regulation. They couldn't even tell me how many regulations they had. We have 15,000, it turns out. And go through them and get rid of outdated, burdensome regulations. Where can we improve customer service? Where can we get to a yes or no quicker? Where are we making mistakes, and how can we fix that through the regulatory process? It's really, a lot of it is just providing good customer service to the citizens that we serve. So just for example, we started doing our bidding of oil and gas leases online on state trust lands instead of literally making you show up at the steps of the DNRC in Helena. Trying to address our workforce shortage, we flipped a ratio that previously required for every apprentice 2 journeymen to train that apprentice, from 2 to 1 to 1 to 2, so that now 1 journeyman can train 2 apprentices. We've tripled the number of apprentices that are now in the trades just from that single regulatory change. And then, of course, we had to take a look at the statutes also. So internal policies, regulations, and the statutes. And by the time the legislators came to town, our agencies had waiting for them 250 different bills that we identified as necessary to continue improving our processes and the red tape relief. Two of them that I'll just give you some examples. One of the areas was increasing licensing mobility for those workers who are in licensed professions, which spans from the trades to the healthcare to our psychiatrists. So we presented a package of bills just trying to improve the ability for someone who's licensed, for example, as a nurse out of state, to be able to immediately hit the ground working when they come into Montana. And saw a lot of success with those during the legislative session. But what I also found out is everybody likes cutting red tape until it's their red tape. So we did run into some resistance from some of the occupations. Change is hard, and didn't get absolutely every bill we had proposed passed. But we'll be back. We learned, we need to do a better process reaching out to all the professions and getting them on board as we go through that. Another important red tape bill was agriculture is our number one industry, and agriculture is very dependent upon water rights. So we introduced a bill. When we came into office, we found out that the backlog of pending water right permits, after 1973, for a new water permit, generally, you have to get a permit from the DNRC, and that's a process that's supposed to take, on paper, about a year. Well, we identified one permit that had been out there for 15 years and several for 3 to 4 years. And then what happens? If you as a developer can't get a water right for a new subdivision, you're going to figure out a way to do it that always isn't compliant, or you're going to depend on some exemptions. So it was really important to us to kind of do an overview of what our water rights systems look like, making sure we have the proper processes in place. And I'm thrilled to announce that House Bill 114 was passed, and that gets rid of some of the black holes where a water permit could just be dangling in space for up to 15 years, and now have a 105-day period within which, if you go through the right steps, you can now obtain a new water right. I guess it was a double-edged sword. We came into the session with a $2.5 billion surplus. And that caused quite a few conversations about what to do with that surplus. And I think the conversations ended up spending it about 3 times over. But in the end, we are going to have a balanced budget. And so some of the things that you'll be seeing is income tax rebates for Montana residents. You will be receiving automatically, commencing July of this year, $1,250 income tax rebate for your 2021 taxes, as long as you filed an income tax return in 2021 and 2020. So we're really trying to benefit Montana residents with that 2-year requirement. $2,500 for married couples, but if your tax liability was less, obviously you're going to get a little bit less. The legislature passed a property tax rebate, so that for each of the years 2022, which, by the way, your taxes are due May 31st, second half 2022 taxes coming up, you'll be getting up to a $500 tax rebate, property tax, at the state's expense, not at the county's expense, for 2022 and 2023 property taxes. It's for a primary residence that you've lived in for at least 7 months, and that won't be automatic, but you'll all be getting notices about what the process is. You can either file online or through a paper form to claim those starting August 15th of 2023 for your 22 taxes, and a similar process next year as well. One of the things we heard a lot of talk about at the beginning of the session was the supermajority. The Republicans had a supermajority, 68 of 100 in the House, 34 of 50 in the Senate, and there was a lot of conjecture about proposed constitutional amendments, because to get a constitutional amendment to a ballot for the voters to approve, it requires 2/3 of the entire legislature to get those on the ballot, and then a majority of voters has to approve it. And there were literally over 100 constitutional amendment requests. 19 of them ended up being introduced, and guess how many actually passed? Nada, 0, not one. So there's a lot of chatter about that, but actually very little. And by the way, us politicians tend to talk too long, Tim, so you need to keep me on time. How much time do I have left? I'm doing fine, okay. along the line of red tape relief too, we just tried to improve processes, including judicial processes, litigation processes. The Montana Environmental Protection Act requires environmental reviews for lots of permitting and other activities, construction activities that go on, and I'm proud that the legislature, adopted many categorical exclusions so that if they're relatively minor projects or related to grants that you're applying for, we've done away with an intensive MEPA analysis. There also is a clarification in April of this year. The Laurel Northwest Energy Plant, a judge stopped that. It had received an air permit from the Department of Environmental Quality, saying that the state had to examine basically climate change, the effect of greenhouse emissions, even though there's a statute that's been on the book for several years that prohibits the Department of Environmental Quality from doing that, because it necessarily requires a regional, if not national, or even global, certainly up into Canada, impact, and how do you gather all that data? So the legislature, after that ruling came out, suspended their rules and introduced legislation clarifying that the Department of Environmental Quality does not have to take greenhouse gas emissions into effect when determining air quality permits unless and until Congress enacts legislation requiring them to do so. We had quite a few real property bills come through. The Chinese air balloon caused a lot of discussion. And a couple of bills were introduced, one of which was passed, which prohibits, quote unquote, foreign adversaries, and that does include China, from owning agricultural property, critical infrastructure, or a residence within sight of a military installation. So if any of you have clients that currently lease property to one of these foreign adversaries, or any company, corporation headquartered in a foreign adversary country, or if those persons own property, they have to divest themselves by October 1 of 2024. So just be aware of that. Also, another major bill, all of you real estate agents out there, now requires a seller to make a disclosure of the condition of a residence upon the sale of a residence. It doesn't apply to commercial properties or agricultural property, but to residences. There's some transfers that are exempt, like family-to-family transfers or probate transfers, and you can waive it, but pay attention to that and go look up that new law, which you need to be aware of. And with regard to homeowner covenants, a law was passed that makes it a little bit more difficult to enforce homeowner covenants. I like homeowner covenants. When my neighbor brought a pig into her yard to raise, I pulled out the homeowner covenants and I politely went over and told her that the pig had to go. And she asked if she could at least keep it and butcher it, and I said, as long as you give me some pork chops, you can do that. But the point of the bill is, if there's a violation of a covenant, if I hadn't have gone over and I'd let her keep the pigs there, if you don't enforce your covenants, you can lose your right to enforce them, is clarified by this bill. So if a breach occurs of a covenant and nobody enforces it for 8 years, you can't later enforce a breach of that covenant. So just a wide spectrum of bills that were passed. In hindsight, I really appreciate the hard work of the legislature. We did do some good work. We accomplished some good things. I do think we left with a better business climate for all of you to thrive and succeed, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that from the representatives as well as Todd. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. So don't leave your car overnight at the mall or it's going to get... Is that a covenant? Probably not. All right. Okay, next. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I will now introduce Mark Thane, a representative for the state of Montana. Mark is a Missoula native, University of Montana graduate, and completed a 39-year career in Missoula's public schools, retiring as superintendent in 2019. He served in 2021 and 2023 sessions of the Montana Legislature, representing House District 99 in Missoula. His legislative committee assignments include House Taxation, he's vice chair, House Education, and House Local Government. He served as on the Revenue Interim Committee during the 21-22 interim. He currently serves on the boards of Community Medical Center, Partnership Health Center. Previous board service includes Young Audiences of Western Montana, the Missoula Education Foundation, the United Way, the Missoula Economic Partnership, the Missoula Family YMCA, and Spark Arts Missoula. My honor to introduce Mark Thane.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to Kim Luttrell, who we haven't seen on the podium yet, but again, I appreciate her long service to the Missoula Chamber. Certainly recognize Todd O'Hare as the state CEO for the Montana Chamber, and the state chamber came in on two of the bills that I introduced this session, so I'm indebted. One of them currently sits on the governor's desk, and I'm hoping the lieutenant governor will advocate for a signature here in the coming days. I also want to express my appreciation to the Lieutenant Governor. She obviously spoke at some length about the red tape initiative, and that was a little bit of a double-edged sword. 250 bills were waiting for us when we got to Helena. That was a lot of hearings to conduct. Started the session off in a relatively busy fashion, but it also had a couple other side benefits. One being that many of the bills we saw in the early portion of the session were passed unanimously or nearly unanimously, and I think it helped foster some collaboration that I think was really important in terms of setting a tone for the session. So I do thank the Lieutenant Governor for that. She did, however, omit any discussion of my favorite red tape relief bill, so I'll digress for just 1 minute. Any of you ever, as a youth, go door to door selling apples for your clubs, anything like that? Did you have a huckster's license when you did that? Under state statute, you were in violation if you did not possess a huckster's license. One of the things that happened as a result of the red tape relief initiative is that that's no longer on the book. So your own children may be absolved. But again, I appreciate the work that the Lieutenant Governor did in that regard. And I would also acknowledge my colleague Lyn Hellegaard. And again, we represent different political parties from Missoula, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And I mean this very sincerely. Good ideas are not the province of one party or the other. And I think one of the things that you'll see in a couple of the bills I discussed today is that we're able to meld ideas from both parties to make legislation better and hopefully serve the best interests of the state of Montana. So just a quick overview of the legislative session. There were 4,648 bill draft requests. 1,698 of those bills were actually introduced, and we held hearings in committee. 125 of those bills dealt with alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana, so it was a busy session for those. 1,103 of the bills passed out of committee to the floor, and 1,056 bills passed from one chamber and were transmitted to the other. Ultimately, 801 bills were passed, and I don't know yet how many will ultimately be signed. The Lieutenant Governor and Governor and their team are busy still reviewing that legislation and making determination about what will be signed. 290 of those bills originated in the Senate, and 511 of the bills that passed originated in the House. That makes sense. The House is a larger chamber, but also all appropriations bills have to start in the House. As was referenced, we got to Helena with a $2.5 billion surplus, which again was that double-edged sword. There was a lot of discussion on how it should be spent. As the Lieutenant Governor referenced, ultimately $764 million will be rebated to Montana taxpayers in the form of the income tax as well as property tax rebates. I do want to take just a second and ask you to contemplate the source of that surplus. And I really think there are probably three key components. The first being we had a lot of federal money, ARPA money, federal government relief money that flowed during the pandemic. And although that was not necessarily taxable as it came to the state, as it was paid out in payroll protection or in infrastructure projects, that money rolled over through our communities repeated times. And those were taxable events. So we had a significant surplus because we had income tax collections that were significant. A second factor in those income tax collections were that we had huge gains in the stock market in the years leading up to the pandemic. And anyone who divested him or herself of some of those stocks likely had capital gains. We had an inordinately high amount of capital gains tax that was collected. Another factor with capital gains is we've seen the escalation of home prices and agricultural price in land. And as those properties turn over, the previous owners may have exceeded the amount they could shelter in terms of capital gains, so they may have paid capital gains on that. And finally, despite the number of help wanted signs you see around Missoula, and many of you as business people likely are struggling to identify and attract employees, Montana currently employs more people than at any time in its history. And month after month, we've set new records in that regard. And on top of that, there's been wage inflation. So the combination of more workers, higher wages, we have greater income tax collections. So those are the factors that I think led to us having such a significant surplus. The Republicans and the Democrats all had priorities as we reached Helena. And I want to take just a minute and talk about what our priorities were. They're certainly not exclusive. I think there's probably a great deal of overlap between those two parties as well as the administration. Workforce housing is a huge issue. And again, I don't need to tell you that. As was referenced, I sit on a couple local boards. And in both those organizations, you can try and recruit employees to Missoula, but unless they can find housing and it's affordable or attainable housing, oftentimes those job offers are refused. So housing was a significant issue. The second issue is childcare. And again, this is an area where I was fortunate as school superintendent to collaborate with Kim and the chamber to have discussions about childcare. The Montana Department of Labor indicates there are about 27,000 Montana parents that are currently out of the workforce because they cannot access or they cannot afford childcare. That's significant and that needs to be addressed. Thirdly, healthcare, long-term care is in crisis. 12 long-term care facilities have closed in Montana over the last year. One of them right here in Missoula, in House District 99. Part of that's a reflection of the low reimbursement rates in Medicaid. So the state conducted a provider rate study. The legislature worked to do its best to fund as much of that provider rate study as they could. And again, that was a bipartisan effort. Mary Cafaro from the Democratic side and Baum Keaton from the Republican side worked really diligently to try and craft a response in that regard. And finally, we can talk a lot about taxes, and I'll get to that in a minute. As was referenced, I'm vice chair of the House Taxation Committee, which is my favorite committee, kind of a nerdy thing, quite honestly. So just a moment on childcare. A couple things that happened and a couple things just to frame the conversation. First of all, in Missoula, currently only 40% of the demand for licensed registered childcare is being met. That's a significant issue for us as a community, and we as a community need to rally around solutions. A couple things that happened in the legislature, House Bill 187 clarified that childcare is a residential use of property. So that basically makes sure that we authorize those home-based small child cares. Secondly, House Bill 648 was the Best Beginning Scholarships. And $7 million was committed in each year of the biennium for childcare scholarships when that childcare is offered by a licensed or registered provider. And those families that make up to 185% of the poverty level can access those scholarships, and they pay basically on a sliding scale. And no more than 9% of their family income is committed to childcare. So the hope is, of course, that that will allow others to access childcare. Subsequently, those individuals will be able to access the workforce. With regard to tax relief, I'll skip over part of my comments because the Lieutenant Governor did a nice job of summarizing the rebates. One of the things that was a concern to me, and it goes back to campaigning both of the last two cycles. When I knocked on doors, an awful lot of people wanted to talk about their property taxes. Nobody wanted to talk about their income tax. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. Number one, you pay income tax every time you get paid through your withholding. Certainly you might pay some at the end of the year, but it's not this huge bite that comes all at once. That's been a problem with property taxes. And second of all, local government, municipalities really fund themselves with only one revenue stream, and that's property tax, whereas the state's largely driven by resource extraction and income tax. So property tax relief is elusive. As the Lieutenant Governor said, you'll get a property tax rebate. Right now, the state collects 101 mills of property taxes. 95 of those go to school equalization and are redistributed across the state. And 6 mills go to the university system. But the state itself really doesn't collect much in terms of property tax. And that's made it challenging for the state to provide property tax relief. An example, I ran a bill, had a great hearing in the tax committee that would have provided some property tax relief across the state. However, it failed in committee, and the rationale the committee used to kill the bill basically was it was taking income tax revenues to reduce property tax, and they didn't feel the two should be commingled. So that creates a real challenge. What source do we have to reduce our property tax burden if we don't utilize some income tax or some resource extraction tax? Something to contemplate in the interim. So we're leaving Helena without really affecting significant property tax reduction, and that's problematic. One of the other things that was accomplished, however, with the surplus was done through House Bill 251. And the slogan that the administration used was debt-free in 23. The state over the years has bonded for a number of significant facility and infrastructure projects. And a huge portion of the surplus was used to pay off that bond indebtedness. I think that's a good thing. However, I did have some reservations. For example, one of the series of bonds that was issued carried an interest rate of 1.65%. And we, as a state, through the investment pool, were making about 3.5% interest. So I would argue it might be a good idea to set that money aside and let it earn some interest and pay off the bonds. However, the decision was made to pay off the bonds and to defease those bonds that weren't presently callable. Again, it puts the state in a good position financially. Whether or not it was the exact best approach might be cause for discussion. House Bill 221 also reduced capital gains tax. So capital gains have largely been taxed at approximately the same rate that you pay on state income tax. And now that'll be reduced significantly, cut almost in half on your state tax liability. So that'll be a good thing for individual income tax payers. And finally, Senate Bill 121 reduced the top marginal tax rate in the state from 6.5% to 5.9%, which again, we'll see in each of our pocketbooks as we move through the interim. The question is then, what financial position will that leave the state of Montana as we move forward? And we have a number of projections that are healthy. Our economy continues to grow. Although we talk about recession, we talk about the potential for a soft landing from a recession, Montana continues to be in a very favorable position in terms of revenue. And all the numbers that we see show us continuing to increase our income tax withholding, even when we contemplate the reduction in total income tax. So that's a good thing. I do want to take just a minute, though, and mention that there were areas where we weren't always in agreement. As was referenced, a significant number of constitutional amendments were proposed. The Democrats almost universally support the Constitution as it exists and opposed amending the Constitution. We had obviously bipartisan support because we were a super minority. But I think preserving the Montana State Constitution is in the interest of all, and so none of those will be on the ballot this fall. We also spent a fair amount of time talking about some social issues. And I would argue that regardless of what your personal feelings are with regard to reproductive rights up to and including abortion or gender-affirming care, the Montana Constitution guarantees a right to privacy. And I would argue that individuals should be accorded their privacy and the opportunity to assume personal responsibility, to have those conversations with a physician, to make those decisions without the state exerting an interest there. So that was an area that garnered a lot of headlines and was a challenge for all of us. I don't know that there's any right or wrong answer in many of these issues, and I think a lot of us lost a lot of sleep as we contemplated them. But again, just have tremendous respect for colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I think we did a tremendous amount of good work during the session. Again, the good ideas aren't the province of one party or the other, and we know that we have a course of work that we need to undertake during the interim if we're going to continue to serve the best interest of Montana. It's certainly a lot to do with helping foster a business and industry climate in the state of Montana, providing for a good education system that will provide you with the workers you need to sustain your businesses, providing childcare infrastructure so that parents can participate in the economy is going to be critical. And then continuing to look for opportunities to modify our tax system and try and find relief for property taxes. Last thing I had on my list was TIF. I probably don't have a lot of time to talk about TIF and TED, but we did have bills before us. The chamber stepped in actually and helped us defer any action on TIF at this time. My personal feeling is we probably need to contemplate what we have to do in the interim. There may need to be some sideboards, but I think we in the Missoula community can look at what it's accomplished for us. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Just downtown infrastructure. If you look at the former Mercantile location that sat vacant for 7 years, it was generating about $30,000 a year in property tax. With the investment that helped for the deconstruction and the infrastructure that supports that property, a new facility was built there and more than quadrupled the property tax that's generated on that property. None of the money for TIF goes to any vertical construction, but my personal feeling would be that rather than go farther out and incur sprawl by having a business locate on a green site, if we through TIF districts can help for redevelopment of a site, deconstruction of old, dilapidated facilities, and put in appropriate infrastructure so they can build in the core, it's a benefit to us. And it really is not something that negatively impacts your tax. The tax when the TIF district is constructed is frozen at that level. And as new infrastructure is built and taxed at a higher rate, that increase in the tax goes to repay the bonds or the infrastructure investments that were made on that property and also support other projects in that area. The last comment I'll make about TIF is that in Missoula right now, there are 990 housing units, largely affordable or attainable workforce housing units that are in the pipeline that would be jeopardized if we lost access to TIF money. So again, we may need some sideboards. but it's a huge economic driver for this community. And there are examples we can see all over town. So I encourage you to engage in that conversation. I think it'll be a great conversation in the interim, and I hope that we can be proactive rather than reactive as we address TIF in 2025. So with that, thank you. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go right down the line. It's my honor to also introduce Montana Representative Lyn Hellegaard. Lyn was born in Moab, Utah. She's married to Steve, and they have 2 children. Lyn graduated from Sentinel High School, representative of the Montana House of Representatives District 97 from 2023 to present. She's been a councilwoman, candidate for the Montana State House of Representatives, District 97. She's a member of the Appropriations Committee. She's a member of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. She's a former adult instructor, American Institute of Banking. She's former Associate Vice President at FIB, Executive Director of the Missoula Valley Transportation Management Association, and she has experience in the small business world. It's my honor to introduce Lyn Hellegaard.
Thank you all for coming. Those 2 didn't cover 3 bills, so I will talk about those. Actually, there were some areas that they didn't touch on, so I don't want to be redundant, so I'll just hit on a few. We did concentrate on energy. One of the bills I introduced that didn't get through, but I've been asked to bring it back, would have notified the PSC and the Attorney General's office if the federal government wanted to shut down or decommission or just reduce the production of our electric facilities. I think it's really important for business that we know what shape our electrical grid is in. If we need to start putting maybe some infrastructure and money into that until something else, and we just don't have that information. So that bill also would have gotten the legislature that information. On taxes, the other bill that we did pass, it will help reclassify the petroleum tanks that are buried. If the federal government keeps pushing us towards the electric vehicle economy, those tanks are going to have to come out. Some of those have been sitting with no action taken on them since the 1970s. So we need to get that figured out and figure if we need to put some money towards that. Taxes. We did some things that will broaden our tax base. One of the things that some people weren't happy with, but we felt was necessary, was to start placing a tax on electric vehicles. Those vehicles are much heavier than your gas-powered vehicles, so they do a lot more damage to our roads. So we needed to generate some money into our tax funds so that we can maintain that infrastructure. We also gave tax credits to quite a few people. The movie tax credit that was voted down, in particular my vote, I voted no on that. I was supportive of it until they amended it to where they got to double dip. I don't think that was quite right. It allowed them to take per diems for their staff, both in the tax credit and on their business tax. So that's why I voted no on that one. On the Appropriations Committee, my subcommittee oversees the Department of Transportation. We voted in a bill that allows their construction projects to be streamlined. They've had that a pilot project now since the last session. It's worked very well. So hopefully we will have more projects during the construction season rather than these long lines where very little gets done. We also passed a bill, actually 2 bills, that will bring us up to the federal regulations with your commercial driver's license. Right now, if we did not get that bill passed, any driver that had a CDL in Montana, it would not be recognized in any other state. So we needed to get that fixed, and we did get that done for our CDL drivers. Mental health. Bob Keenan, I spent a lot of time with Representative Keenan. He's been in the legislature a long time. Our mental health system has been in neglect for almost 2 decades. Mr. Keenan had fixed that system. I was very glad to work with him to get that fixed. We're not just doing the same old things. He's done a lot of studies in the interim. I know that that should help our business community, since some of you, when I was on council, were having homeless people sleeping in front of your doors, making it difficult for your staff to get to work in the morning. So hopefully these fixes will help, one of which is analyzing whether we should move some of our state facilities. Right now they're in communities where there just isn't a workforce. So we're looking, and we've appropriated money to look at different locations to place them where there is the workforce to help those people. The other thing that we worked on were some veteran bills. One of them I carried that will help them, the 100% disabled vets, maintain their tax reduction status if they have a one-time unusual expense. One of the veterans here in Missoula asked me to carry that bill. He's 100% disabled. He had a son-in-law that had a drug and alcohol problem. They had 7 kids at the time. They'd lost their home. They had to file bankruptcy. They lost their car. He said, I'll step in, your mom and I, and we'll fund the son-in-law's rehab, and we'll cover the family until he's recovered. The Department of Revenue took that because he took the money out of his 401k. They took that as an income. It kicked him out of his status. He fought it for 4 years before it was reinstated. So we just put some parameters in there so it makes it easy for the Department of Revenue to make those decisions. We also, in House Bill 4, appropriated additional money. Right now, our veteran services get about $200,000 a year. We've kicked that up to about $2 million, and what we plan to do with that money is there's a very successful program down in Ravalli County where they set up a county veteran service center. I think it was in 2021. That center was able to bring in an additional $862,000 to that community due to the increased claims or claims being completed. It's a great program. Right now, the way the state's set up is a veteran service officer might go to, say, Mineral County for 2 hours a month. Just to get a veteran their DD4, sometimes it will take a half an hour. To do a complicated disability claim, it can take over a month. But these veteran service officers also, when they're certified, can access the VA database. So they can help these veterans monitor their claims, keep them up to speed. So that money will be used to set up these service centers in each county. So the veterans will have somebody there 5 days a week to help them with their claims, or their family members. When they first started that, they had 5 years of back death claims that they were able to clean out in 60 days. So I look forward to having our veterans and our VA system reconfigured and improved in the state. Schools. They talked a little bit about schools. House Bill 587. They instituted a tax-based mechanism that the goal is to reduce local property taxes when it comes to your schools. So, most of us kept in our minds what Representative Thane said, that people were complaining about their property taxes. We needed to do something about that. Being on appropriations, I thought about that with every bill that came before us. What is this going to do to property taxes? What is this going to do to business expenses? One of the bills that we heard towards the end of the session, they wanted to mandate on the insurance companies that they provide coverage for people that are going through cancer, that they help them with their reproductive needs. So store the eggs, the sperm, until they're ready to use it. And although that was a heart-wrenching bill, that mandate would have driven up everyone's insurance rates. So, you know, in appropriations, that's probably the hardest thing for us. We've got to make the tough fiscal decisions. And sometimes it's very hard, and we lay awake nights wondering if we did the right thing. The other thing that we did on appropriations and we kept in mind was we did anticipate that financially we might have a 20-year event where the housing bubble goes, layoffs, we're seeing those in the tech sector, and we wanted to make sure that Montana was able to provide for our citizens and help our business communities, and that's why we set up all of those, as Lou Jones calls them, buckets. So we've got our fire fund, we've got our savings fund, we've got some other things that are triggered where we set money aside. We were able to get one bill through that dealt with some pensions. We've got some issues in our pensions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get both bills through, but we got the ones through for our law enforcement, firefighters, emergency providers. The other thing that we did, a bill that we got through, is a zoning bill that allows townhouses and condos to be placed in commercial zones now. So if you have an old warehouse, we can now rehab that and turn it into housing. So that, I think, will help with the affordable housing stuff. So with that, have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Lynn. Just a program note, because I think there's some people that think that this is going till 2 o'clock this afternoon. The last hour is optional. I'm going to give a talk about Easter Bunny and Santa Claus costume care. So if you want to stay for that and stay till 2, that's great. But we are going to be finishing at 1 o'clock. So not sure how that happened, but there we go. Our last speakers, who I have the honor of introducing, is Todd O'Hare from the Montana Chamber of Commerce. He's the CEO. In 2019, Todd O'Hare officially took over as president and CEO of the Montana Chamber of Commerce. The Montana Chamber of Commerce is the state's largest business advocacy organization. In this capacity, Todd represents approximately 2,000 member companies representing every size, industry, and region in the state. Todd is responsible for executing the economy by focusing on improving the state's business climate, appropriate investment in infrastructure, workforce development, and promoting entrepreneurship. A Montana native, Todd hails from Livingston, where his family owns a multi-generational family ranch in the Paradise Valley. Before being named president and CEO of the Montana Chamber, Todd was the senior manager of government affairs for a major coal mining company, Cloud Peak Energy. While at Cloud Peak, he served on the Montana Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and was the chair of the board in 2016 and 17. Before Cloud Peak Energy, Todd worked in Governor Judy Martz's office for 4 years. He also served as the Natural Resources Policy Advisor for Congressman Rick Hill in Washington, D.C., and later as State Director. A Montana State University graduate with a degree in business marketing, Todd resides in Paradise Valley with his wife Melissa and 3 children, including 2 that attend Livingston Public Schools and 1 that is attending medical school at OHSU in Portland, Oregon. My honor, Todd O'Hare.
Well, thank you. And I'll start by noting the Montana Chamber of Commerce is driven by a strategic plan. And it's the strategic plan that focuses us, particularly during legislative sessions, to focus on those sort of business items that matter most to businesses. And it was a brainchild that started in about 2013, 2014, with the recognition by the Montana Chamber Board of Directors that we need to do something in Montana to turn around this doldrum of an economy that we consistently live in. How do we build an economy in Montana that we as Montanans deserve? And so after about 2 years of working with business leaders from sole proprietors to publicly traded companies, agriculture, natural resources, manufacturing, high tech, the business community came to us and said, if you're going to improve Montana's economy, you need to focus on 4 areas. And the 4 areas are, 1, general business climate. That's taxes, make sure we have an appropriate tax climate in Montana, make sure we have an appropriate regulatory structure in Montana. Tort reform, how do we make sure that Montana's legal environment is such that it provides a certain amount of certainty to businesses to be able to operate in the state? And so general business climate was one of those pillars. The second one was infrastructure. So if we're going to have a world-class economy, we need a world-class infrastructure, roads, bridges, water treatment facilities, healthy, vibrant downtown communities, access to high-speed internet and broadband. The third piece was workforce development, which was interesting enough. In 2016, the business community said, if we're going to have an economy that grows, we're going to have a skilled, trained, and appropriately educated workforce. And I always underscore the appropriately educated portion of that because we're big believers that not every child has to go to a 4-year university. That we need to be preparing kids for life after they graduate high school, whether their path takes them through a 4-year university or 2-year college or straight into the workforce. And so we're big supporters of career and technical education and the skilled trades. And the final component that we focus on as our strategic plan is entrepreneurship. And it was recognized that entrepreneurism creates wealth and that Montana consistently ranks as one of the top entrepreneurial states in the country. Nobody really knows why. Is it because we're this independent, fierce Western state? Or is it because we've had such a mediocre economy for so long that everybody's forced to pick up a side gig? Whatever the reason is, we should go at it with intent. And how do we build a pipeline of entrepreneurs coming through our education system, particularly through the K through 12 and beyond? And so that's the lens that we look at. And that was particularly important as we go into this legislative session because there were so many issues that had a business or a general business sort of component to it. But we kept going back to our strategic plan and saying, does this improve Montana's business climate? Does this help entrepreneurship? Does this improve our infrastructure? Does this assist in the workforce development arena? And I got to tell you that the Montana Chamber of Commerce had the most successful legislative session on behalf of businesses in our history. We brought forward 10 bills that came from our members that aimed at improving the business climate in Montana. Overwhelmingly, those bills dealt with tort reform. And they're complicated. They're the most non-sexy, non-glamorous sort of bills that you can imagine. They deal with litigation. They deal with the threat of litigation. They deal with the time frame that if you are sued, that you're stuck in litigation. But I can tell you that these bills, particularly cumulatively, improve the Montana business climate, particularly as it relates to the business insurance that every business has to pay. And bringing those 10 bills forward, 9 of them passed through the legislative session. 8 have been signed by the governor, and we're confident that the 9th will be signed by the governor. I will tell you that I don't think there's another organization in the state of Montana that was able to have that sort of number of bills brought to the legislature, certainly none that had that sort of a track record and that sort of success. We could not have been successful in this arena if it hadn't been working with like Kim Luttrell here in the Missoula Chamber of Commerce. We work with Kim on a daily basis at times, on weekly calls. We compared notes. We talked about our priority bills on behalf of the business community, as well as the whole host of other bills that we're moving through the legislative session. And so we're particularly proud of like that set of legislation we brought that we believe that is going to significantly improve Montana's general business climate. Amongst those bills, and I'm not going to bore you with them, one of the ones I think we were most proud of is one that's related to product liability reform. And we essentially brought Montana's product liability statutes up to reasonably in sync with the rest of the country, so that Montana no longer is a state that you can venue shop to sue if you are injured by a manufacturer. I think this is particularly important because Montana's got such a vibrant and growing manufacturing base. And so making sure that manufacturers in this state have reasonable protections against their product that they manufacture, and those that are retailers that sell those products. And so we're particularly proud of that. On the tax front, I think we supported all the governor's tax package bills, largely based upon the fact that we're not particularly interested in making sure that Montana races to the bottom of the income tax or the tax race in the Mountain West or in the western part of the United States, but we need to be competitive. We need to make sure that Montana's tax rates aren't a disqualifier when a business is looking at Montana to relocate here. We especially don't want it to be a disincentive for a business that became successful in Montana, that the tax rates are so high now that they want to move that business out of the state. And so we were supportive of almost entirely, I think, the governor's tax package bill. Of that, the one that we were the most proud of was the business equipment tax, moving the business equipment tax exemption from $300,000 to $1 million. And that's a significant bump in tax exemption for businesses, particularly for small and mid-sized sort of businesses, particularly in light of the fact that businesses are increasingly having to turn to automation in order to meet their workforce challenges. You think about $1 million, it doesn't take much to have $1 million worth of equipment in a business anymore. Most medium-sized restaurants probably have $1 million worth of equipment in their restaurant. So being able to move that $300,000 exemption to $1 million, significant for those businesses, particularly in that small to medium sort of price range. And so those were some of the big issues that we got involved with. We played a lot of defense. We like to tell folks that, you know, we act as a shield and a sword for Montana businesses. We had a heavy presence in the Montana legislative session. Those 10 bills that we brought forward weren't easy. It's a lot easier to kill legislation than it is to pass it. Really hard to pass legislation. Those 10 bills that we brought forward, we started working on them with the governor's office and the lieutenant governor at the conclusion of the 2021 legislative session. And we worked them clear through this legislative session here. That was a direct cost to the Montana Chamber and our dues-paying members of $428,000. It's about $50,000 a bill. For the attorneys, the lobbying, all the work that we have to do to prepare legislation to get it moved through. And so as we look ahead, we're already preparing for our next legislative session. And where is it we're going to focus our energies between now, which we've already started, and the start of the 2025 session? We've got some issues related to tort reform that we want to pick up. I think there's an endless list of issues related to tort reform or litigation reform that we can tackle in Montana to provide that extra assurance to businesses that are operating here or looking to move here. So we've got some tort reform ideas that we're starting to look at already. Taxes is going to continue to be a big issue going forward, particularly as it relates to property taxes with businesses. We need to continue to make sure that Montana is competitive on the income tax and the capital gains front. So we're going to be taking a look at taxes as we look ahead. Childcare. These are two issues that we continually hear about from businesses the most, is affordable housing or attainable housing and childcare. And childcare falls into two buckets. It's access to childcare and affordable childcare. And so we're going to start taking a look at what can we do on the childcare front on a statewide sort of a basis to address this issue, because it's one of the most significant headwinds that businesses face. And finally, there was a lot of talk about tax increment finance districts, and Representative Thane mentioned that. And if we can get business support we want to dive into the tax increment finance districts, the TIFs. We think this is an important tool for communities, particularly for those communities that are trying to revitalize downtown areas. It's part of an infrastructure component that we need to be able to have healthy communities, but I think we also can acknowledge that there's probably some work that needs to be done there. And if we're going to get outside of a perennial fight around TIF districts, we need to take an honest look at what's it going to take to make some honest improvements there. And how can we provide certainty to the businesses that want to invest in these areas so they can continue to revitalize those areas. And so I touched on a kind of a broad level of issues that the Montana Chamber brought forward during this legislative session. So we couldn't have done it without Kim Luttrell and the Missoula Chamber and all the chambers around the state. We work very, very closely with them. We had a heavy presence during this legislative session. We couldn't have done it without the close collaboration that we had with the governor's office and lieutenant governor. And I'm going to close by just pointing out something that I think deserves to be pointed out, is that when a legislature like this last year wraps up, you probably read a lot and heard a lot about the flashpoints and the big controversial sort of items and the big clashes. But I think you saw a little bit here today between the two parties that they agree more than they disagree. And they have civil disagreements when they do more than not. You just don't hear about it as much. And so I want to thank particularly our legislators that are here today for their role in their civility and representing the people of the state of Montana. Thank you.
Stole some of my closing there, Todd. I am in awe of, and all four of you actually. You know, I know the hard work that that you guys just experienced the last 3 months. It's a grind, and we've heard about it. I've talked to other legislators. It's an amazing feat to get through that 3 months every 2 years. It's just a bunch of stuff to do, and I also know that there's a bunch of people in this room that did the same thing. It's a celebratory moment for Missoula having you four here, and then the work that you all accomplished in your respective businesses and world through this legislative session. I think this meeting was important. I think your information was very important for everybody to hear and see your views and see the wins and some of the things that you're concerned about in the future. And I just want to give you my deepest thanks for your commitment to the state, to Missoula, and give you guys a big round of applause. We also have some other thanks to give of Jackson Contractor Group and TDS. Appreciate your support in sponsoring the event today. And the Missoula Chamber staff, you guys did a great job, pulled it off, great event, super turnout, and I'd also like to thank the Doubletree for their service tonight. I kind of tried to dress up like the servers, so to be a part of the team. And then, of course, thank all of you for attending. It's a cool event. I've gone to it just about every year that I moved here in 2006, and love hearing the different viewpoints of the different views. And that's the other thing, the civility that you mentioned, Todd, in the room and up here at the table. I just think that it's a great example for all of us moving forward. So that's what I got. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next year.